We've all heard of the power of persuasion. It can completely change someone's views on a subject, and it can even alter a person's choices as well as their life. Nowadays, we have the internet, and we can easily just pop onto Twitter and view the latest viral meme, or hop onto a news website and check out the latest important updates in our society. However, from the very start of our nation, propaganda is what influenced people's decision-making as a society as a whole. This is especially relevant during times of war because the government needed some way to reach out to the people in order to get a unified public perspective. Professor Richard Allen Nelson defines propaganda to be a systematic form of purposeful persuasion that attempts to influence the emotions, attitudes, opinions, and actions of specific target audiences for ideological, political, or commercial purposes via mass and direct media channels. Taking a more in-depth look at the evolution of propaganda reveals that there is a lot more to it than just political cartoons. Propaganda can take many different forms, such as songs, movies, newspapers, posters, flyers, radio talks, and billboards. All of these forms have to be persuasive in some way in order to achieve their purpose. Americans have faced countless amounts of propaganda throughout our history. Ever since the Revolutionary War, it has touched the masses. But the real question is, what purpose did it serve, and what about it has changed over the past 100 years? So let's start from the beginning, the American Revolution. In order to rally the colonists against the British, there had to be a motivational factor. One huge event that stirred this motivation was the Boston Massacre. This was where British soldiers fired into a crowd of out-of-control colonists, resulting in 5 civilian deaths. In efforts to sway the thinking of the colonists, people like Paul Revere and Sam Adams seized the Boston Massacre as a perfect opportunity to spread some of the most influential propaganda in American history. Revere tried to move the colonists with drawings depicting the event, while Adams wrote in newspapers and pamphlets. They both seemed to portray the scene as if the British had planned a formal attack on their own civilians. This helped persuade the population to object British rule and make them feel scared. Much of the other propaganda of this time resulted from the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act. These acts raised taxes which fueled colonists with anger and revolutionaries with the motivation to create propaganda. The Join or Die political cartoon made by Benjamin Franklin is famous from this war. Each segment on the snake is labeled with the initials of one of the American colonies or regions. It became a symbol of colonial freedom during the American Revolutionary War. Shortly down the line came the Civil War. The Civil War came with many war songs which were supposed to motivate the civilians to embrace the rally for war. At this point, newspapers in America had become a common craze. Harper's Weekly and the New York Times were some of the most notable. Previous to this war, the battle sketches were often drawn, over-glorified, and dramatized. But as the sketch artists with the armies witnessed the rigors and the agony of warfare, their sketches to the illustrated newspapers reflected these experiences. Union propaganda would often try to expose the brutality of slavery in order to arouse anger towards the South. They showed sad scenes like a mother being taken from her child or a slave being whipped. Some Union propaganda even portrays African Americans in roles of the upper class. Clearly, they wanted to show their opposition to slavery. The Union used propaganda in order to recruit Union Army soldiers. A lot of the posters display an eagle carrying arrows. Newspapers often reach out to the local able-bodied men that would be able to fight. This New York Times article from 1863 tries to show the urgency to end the rebellion. It states all the power and energy of the government will be directed to bring every man into the field who can bear a musket. The rebellion must go down. While the Union acquired new troops, they mocked the Confederate troops with propaganda that displayed their troops as weak. This overall helped to motivate their soldiers while degrading their enemies. The Spanish-American War seemed to be a turning point for propaganda with the birth of yellow journalism. The United States' entry into the Spanish-American War was somewhat due to the exaggerations of the terrible conditions in Cuba. It was also fueled by the sinking of the Maine, which became romanticized in propaganda. While trying to help Cuba remove its Spanish rule, the United States seemed to take an imperialistic role. Manifest destiny seemed to be on America's mind, so expanding overseas was in their best interest. This was present in a lot of propaganda. The introduction of Uncle Sam sparked a new sense of nationalism, which went hand in hand with America's imperialistic ideas. They often depicted him in a powerful stance or position, which would represent how strong the United States were as a nation. By the time World War I came about, the US was truly a powerful nation. As powerful as they were, they still had to ration for the war efforts. This meant making propaganda that would convince the public to save their food so that the soldiers would have the strength to win the war. There were many posters that attempted to persuade men to volunteer for the war. This also emphasized the need for specific roles like nurses or Navy men. Many of these included images of Uncle Sam because he remained an iconic symbol for Americans. This article from the Manchester Guardian, published on October 9, 1915, shows the local efforts to promote soldier recruitment. All in all, it says that the plan to coordinate the voluntary effort throughout the country has been finalized and is ready to be put into action. It's almost like a notice to the public that volunteers would be needed shortly. In order to support the war efforts, people could buy Liberty bonds. Many propaganda posters tried to reach out to the home front in order to increase the sales of these Liberty bonds. They try to sound as if it is an honor to buy them and that they will help decide the fate of the war. Many things changed when World War II came around. The Nazis and the Japanese were portrayed as villains in propaganda and media during this period. They used this idea to persuade people on the home front to do things such as buy war bonds or even join a car-sharing club to conserve fuel. It also encouraged the home front to work their hardest to keep production rates up. This allowed the U.S. to have a constant flow of resources to aid the troops. By the effective use of censorship, a reasonable amount of social control was exercised during this time period. In the 1940s, security operations meant avoid talking or writing openly about military actions in order to keep critical information from reaching the ears of adversaries. The Office of War Information issued dozens of propaganda posters designed by well-known artists at this time. This was in order to persuade Americans to support the war effort by keeping quiet about what they might know about. Censorship carried into the Cold War, where the United States had to censor communism because they viewed it as a threat to the nation. This is where anti-communist propaganda started to pop up. Many posters of this time show communist characters doing harmful things to Americans. This helped to create a purely negative American opinion towards communism. Because of all this, movies like The Red Menace and I Married a Communist were made by Hollywood to fuel anti-communist movements. These movies obviously displayed communism in a negative light to gain popular opinion. This simultaneously led to negativity towards Soviet Russia and Stalin. These images tried to shape the Americans' mind to not only resent communism but also to feel that the United States was superior. According to the American Journal of International Law, the U.S. also started radio programs carried by the Voice of America. These tried to address and defend against the statements and propaganda that the Soviet Union was putting out against the United States. In many ways it was successful because it put some false accusations to rest, which made Americans more at ease. Nowadays we encounter American propaganda in everyday life. Maybe we notice it and maybe we don't, but when America demands that its people take action or stand on a unified opinion, then the government makes sure that the media reflects that. Obviously, there is much more propaganda that deals with more aspects than war, such as women's rights or marriage equality, but even so, war propaganda can pertain to many different aspects of life. This propaganda played a vital role in the United States' various successes. Without it, perhaps Americans' morale during times of war would have been much less, leaving the country weakened. It overall pushed Americans to try their hardest for the sake of their country, and so far it has done a pretty good job of doing so.